Hi, I'm Mike, and today we're going to talk about lug nuts. So if you have a custom-built vehicle, a lot of times we're probably going to need your input on what bolt pattern you're using for the hub assemblies on that vehicle. To measure those hub assemblies, a 5-bolt, a 6-bolt, an 8-bolt lug pattern, all those are going to have different ways they're going to need to be measured, which we'll show you here shortly on how we should be measuring those. The other thing is that when you buy a custom wheel assembly for your vehicle, a lot of times the manufacturers may change up the seat type of lug nut that's required to bolt that wheel to the hub assembly. There are a lot of different styles, whether it be a conical seat, which is more of a tapered seat, which we're probably used to on most OEM applications. There's also a shank style as well. And then there's different shank lengths, as well as different lug nut diameters and different taper diameters that may be required depending on the type of wheel being used. When purchasing wheels for a custom application, like say you're building like a 32 Ford and you're using a Ford 9-inch in the rear and Chevy hubs up front, what you'll come to realize is that the Ford 9-inch may use like a 5x4.5 bolt pattern, and the Chevy hubs will probably use a 5x4 3/4 bolt pattern. The thing about that is that we're probably going to need your input to tell us what bolt patterns are on those hubs. Some of these bolt patterns are going to be measured differently depending on whether it's a 5-lug, 6-lug, or an 8-lug. For example, this is how you would measure a 5-lug pattern. You would notice that a 5-lug gets measured from the outer edge of one hole to the center of the adjacent hole. Once the lug pattern of the wheel needed is determined, the next thing we got to look at is the lug seat type required for that wheel. For the most part, the wheels that you purchase from us are either going to be a conical seat or it's going to be a shank style seat lug nut, depending on the wheel type and what the wheel use is really going to be. Like race wheels usually use a shank style lug nut, whereas most street type wheels will use a tapered seat lug nut. There's a lot of different lug nuts out there, and actually sometimes there's actually different seats within the seat, meaning that there may be a different style of conical seat in comparison to different shank lengths for shank style wheels as well. We're going to go ahead and dissect all those here in a moment. So let's go ahead and do a quick rundown of all the different conical seat lug nuts that are out there. For the most part, most wheels that are being purchased from us are going to require a conical seat lug nut, and the seat of those lug nuts required is usually going to be a 60-degree seat. If we were going to have a closed cap wheel, meaning that a wheel that actually had a cap that covered up the lug nuts, we'd probably go with something like this here. It's more of an OEM style lug nut, which has an open end on it. It's fairly short. For exposed lug nut wheels though, ones where you're actually going to see the lug nuts, we would probably go with something like this here, which has a finished end on it. You'll notice that it's got a cap over the end, so it dresses up the look of the wheel a little better. For ET style wheels though from Krager, they actually use a shank conical seat combination, which actually has a shank insert that goes into the hole of the wheel, as well as a conical seat to go ahead and center the wheel on the hub assembly. Some exposed lug nut wheels though, like they refer to them as tuner wheels, actually have a really tight hole assembly, which you'll have trouble getting a socket on. In those cases, you may be able to get away with a 3/4 inch head lug nut, but sometimes those don't even work because you can't get a socket in there on the lug nut assembly. At that point, you'd probably have to go with something like this here, which actually has an internal key setup to go ahead and actually get the lug nut installed and removed from the vehicle. Or you could also go with a spline drive assembly, which uses a really shallow wall socket assembly, which will still fit into that hole like this lug nut right here. Also, in some situations, if we had like a diesel truck or a wheel with a deeply inset setup for the hole, we would go with what's known as a duplex type lug nut, which is actually double the length of the standard style lug nut, so that you can get a better bite on it. If we were going to go ahead and use a set of circle track wheels though, everything changes. Circle track wheels, instead of using a 60-degree lug nut, now use a 45-degree lug nut like this one here, which has a larger, wider surface area to contact the wheel. That would be like an aero race wheel or any type of NASCAR style wheel. Those wheels will only work with this style lug nut alone, and that's it. Selecting lug nuts for a shank style wheel is actually a little easier than selecting for a conical seat wheel, because there's really not as many options as there are with the conical seat lug nuts. For the most part, all you have to figure out with a shank style, which is usually a race type wheel, is the length of the shank assembly. That's the underhead length of each of the lug nuts. For the most part, it's either going to be a 1/2 inch shank, a 3/4 inch shank, or an 1 3/8 shank. And we'll be able to determine that for you depending on which wheel you actually purchase from us. On top of that though, the other thing we have to consider is that there's also going to be a washer assembly that's going to be required for these lug nuts to keep the lug nuts from binding and digging into the wheel when they're tightened down. And that washer is actually used as a spacer and a tensioner as well, because what you'll notice about the washer is it's actually concave, so it works almost like a spring in a sense to create tension against the lug nut and keep it from coming loose. For your unilug wheel guys though, like your Krager SS's and whatnot, sometimes it will not require a standard centered washer. Instead, what it will require is an offset washer if you have the smallest bolt pattern that wheel will accept, like a 5x4 or a 5x4 1/4 bolt pattern, which is closest to the center of that wheel. And what you'll notice is that offset will give you the proper clearance so that the washer does not run into the center cap of that wheel assembly. And the last type of lug nut that's going to be required for our customers that usually have European cars is actually a lug bolt, like this one here, which is actually a tapered seat bolt assembly instead of a nut assembly. These are usually a requirement for aftermarket wheels because the factory wheels on most European cars actually use a cover to cover up the factory lug nuts, whereas the aftermarket wheels will go ahead and have an exposed lug nut instead. As you can see here, the difference between a shank style setup in comparison to a tapered seat lug nut setup. Make sure you check out our other wheel and tire videos, and thanks for watching.